$696 billion. That is how much Africa owes to foreign creditors as of this year. 696 billion, a number so vast it could rebuild the continent 3 times over. Yet this is the same continent that holds 30% of the world's mineral wealth, 60% of its arable land, and the youngest population on Earth. The richest soil buries the poorest people. It is a paradox sharp enough to cut through steel. And on the 1st of October, 2025, in the marble halls of the United Nations in New York City, a young soldier president rose from his seat, looked directly at the guardians of global finance, and said 5 words that would shake the world. Africa owes you nothing. His name is Ibrahim Traore. His nation is Burkina Faso, a landlocked country smaller than the state of Colorado. Yet on that October morning it stood taller than empires. Traore wore no tailored suit, no silk tie. He wore a simple military jacket, dust still clinging to the fabric as if he had just stepped off the battlefield. And in many ways, he had. Before hundreds of television cameras, before the officials of the International Monetary Fund themselves, he did not ask for mercy. He did not plead for relief. He put the system itself on trial. It was David pointing his finger at Goliath, not with a stone, but with truth. For many in that chamber, it felt as though history had stepped back into the room. Some whispered the name of Thomas Sankara, the leader who once dared to say the same words before being silenced forever. Yet here it was again, the old defiance reborn in the voice of a soldier president. And so the question falls to us, is this the spark of a new chapter for Africa, or a moment destined to be crushed by the weight of debt and power? Stay with us. This is more than a headline, it is a hinge in history. What you are about to hear is not simply the story of one speech, but the unfolding of a question that will shape the future of an entire continent. If this resonates with your sense of justice, do not leave. Like this video, comment your thoughts, and subscribe not for us, but to keep the flame of dignity burning. Because what comes next may change how we read the map. Think about the chamber that morning. The United Nations General Assembly is a cathedral of power. Flags from 193 nations hung in solemn silence above polished wooden seats. Delegates in pressed suits whispered in anticipation, their voices a low hum beneath the high ceilings adorned with gold trim and the emblems of global cooperation. Cameras from every corner of the globe were trained on a long wooden podium, their lenses hungry for history. The air carried the weight of expectation. It was supposed to be a routine debate on debt restructuring, dry, technical, forgettable. Another day of diplomatic language, carefully worded proposals, and compromises that changed nothing. In reality, everyone in the room knew the agenda had one word written all over it: Africa. Seated near the front was Ibrahim Traore, the young soldier president of Burkina Faso. His presence alone drew whispers. He was 34 years old, young enough to be the son of most leaders in that hall, yet his eyes carried the weight of a man who had walked through fire. He wore his military jacket not as costume but as reminder. He had risen not through luxury, not through inheritance, but through battlefields where survival was earned, not granted. His hands rested on the table before him, calloused and steady. These were not the hands of a bureaucrat. These were the hands of a soldier who had held rifles, signed orders in the dust, and shaken hands with farmers whose children went to bed hungry despite working land rich with gold. As the chairman introduced the session, his voice echoing through the chamber with the usual platitudes about constructive dialogue and sustainable development, Traore slowly stood. His chair scraped against the floor, the sound cutting through the hum of conversation. The room quieted. Delegates turned, cameras swiveled. His movements were deliberate, his gaze unwavering. He unfolded a single piece of paper, but before even glancing at it, he looked straight at the officials of the International Monetary Fund, seated in the front rows, men and women in expensive suits, folders open, pens poised to take notes. And then he spoke. Africa owes you nothing. The words hung in the air like a blade suspended above a thread. A gasp spread across the chamber like a wave breaking on stone. Heads turned. Translators paused mid-sentence, as if uncertain they had heard correctly. For decades, African leaders had couched their grievances in careful language, appealing for assistance, negotiating for relief, bowing their heads in diplomacy. They had used words like partnership and cooperation, soft terms that masked hard truths. But here was a leader refusing to plead. Instead, he accused, "It is you who owe us the truth." He raised his voice, and what followed was not a speech, it was an indictment. He called it the 7 crimes of the IMF in West Africa, and one by one he laid them bare. Each crime a stone thrown at a fortress built on decades of carefully constructed narratives. First, he spoke of the endless debt traps strangling Ghana and Ivory Coast. His voice was steady as iron, each word measured. Ghana is still buried under a $3 billion bailout from 2022, with obligations to the IMF amounting to over $2.7 billion in special drawing rights as of this very year. He paused, letting the number settle. Instead of investing in its people, Ghana is sending interest payments abroad. Schools remain half-built, hospitals lack medicine, roads crumble, yet every month money flows outward to creditors who never planted a seed in Ghanaian soil. The metaphor was clear. These were nations tilling the soil, planting the seeds, yet watching as the harvest was taken before it ever touched their hands. Ivory Coast, he continued, carries its own heavy chains of debt, its future mortgaged to international creditors before its children are even born. Second, he denounced the forced privatization of Ghana's most precious wealth, the cocoa industry. His voice sharpened, anger seeping through the diplomatic veneer. Once the pride of farmers and the backbone of the economy, cocoa was handed to foreign corporations under IMF pressure. The farmers were left with crumbs, while the profits sailed overseas. He painted the picture with brutal clarity. Hands calloused from labor, fields green with cocoa trees under the equatorial sun, sweat soaking through shirts as machetes cut through pods. Yet pockets empty. Families hungry. Children unable to attend school because the price of the harvest is set not in Accra but in London, in New York, in boardrooms where no African voice is heard. The soil that once fed families now feeds only distant shareholders. It is theft dressed in the language of efficiency. Third, his voice dropped to a quieter register, but the anger remained, simmering beneath the surface like magma beneath stone. He described the cruel cuts to social services in Mali and Senegal. IMF conditions demanded government/budgets for health and education. The results are visible to anyone willing to look. He paused, scanning the room. Some delegates shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at their tablets, unwilling to meet his gaze. Children in Mali go hungry, while hospitals in Senegal decay for lack of funds. You tell these nations to grow, yet you cut the roots and demand the tree flourish. The image lingered in the air. A tree stripped bare, branches skeletal against the sky, expected to bear fruit. It was an absurdity. Yet it was the reality forced upon millions. Fourth, he turned to Nigeria, his voice rising again, recalling the devastating devaluation of the naira in 1986. That collapse, ordered under IMF conditions, destroyed the middle class almost overnight. Prices of imports exploded. Inflation devoured wages. Millions were plunged into poverty. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the podium. Currency turned to dust in people's hands. Savings evaporated. Dreams shattered. And whose hands held the strings? Not Nigeria's. The IMF dictated terms, and a nation obeyed, and a generation paid the price. At this point, I want to invite you into something bigger than watching. Leave a thank you in the comments. It might be, "Thank you, Traore," or "Thank you, Burkina Faso," or simply "Thank you for hope." Why? Because each thank you carries weight. Each thank you says, "I hear this, I feel this, I stand with this." Imagine hundreds of people adding their thanks. It turns a video into a movement. So write your thank you now, and let your voice be part of this shared journey. Fifth, he spoke of Liberia and Sierra Leone, where IMF loans continued to flow despite governments riddled with corruption. His voice quieter now, but no less cutting. Citizens never saw the benefits. They inherited mountains of debt, with no step forward in development. The metaphor was brutal in its simplicity. It was like watering weeds while letting crops die. Resources poured into broken systems while the people starved. Loans that never built schools, funds that never reached hospitals, money that vanished into private accounts while mothers watched their children waste away from preventable diseases. Sixth, he pointed to his own homeland, Burkina Faso. There was a personal edge to his voice now, a quiet fury. Under IMF guidance, my nation was encouraged to export raw gold rather than build local refineries. Gold leaves our soil, jobs do not come, wealth is extracted, and nothing returns. His hand sliced through the air, a gesture of finality. We are encouraged to bleed our land dry, then told we are poor because we do not work hard enough. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. A nation rich in gold, sitting atop reserves worth billions. Yet its people walked barefoot through streets of red dust. Miners worked in dangerous conditions for pennies while the refined gold transformed into jewelry, electronics, currency reserves enriched nations thousands of miles away. Traore paused. The chamber was silent, the kind of silence that presses against the chest and makes breathing difficult. His eyes scanned the room, landing on the IMF officials one by one. Some looked down at their folders. Others met his gaze with expressions carefully neutral, betraying nothing. And then he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a tone that carried more menace than any shout. But there is one crime greater than all these. A crime that does not appear on balance sheets, yet robs nations of their very souls. The room held its breath. Cameras zoomed in, operators adjusting focus, sensing the climax approaching. Delegates leaned forward in their seats. Even the translators seemed to pause mid-sentence, waiting. I speak of the CFA franc, the invisible chain. And with those words, the seventh crime was named. France's monetary control over 14 African nations through the CFA. Franc, a currency born in the colonial era and still tethered to French banks like an umbilical cord that refused to be cut. Traore's voice rose, each word a hammer blow. 50% of reserves held in the French treasury. Sovereignty surrendered. Dignity stolen. He paused, letting the accusations settle like ash after fire. This is not cooperation, this is financial colonialism dressed in the language of partnership. His next words were delivered slowly, deliberately, ensuring every translator captured them, every camera recorded them, every ear in the hall heard them clearly. A nation without its own currency is a bird without wings. It may flap, it may struggle, it may even dream of flight, but it will never rise. The historical weight was undeniable. The CFA franc had been introduced in 1945, originally standing for French colonies of Africa. Though the name was later changed to Financial Community of Africa, the structure remained unchanged. Paris held the keys to the treasury. 14 nations from Senegal to Cameroon, from Benin to Gabon, could not print money, could not set their own monetary policy, could not control their own economic destiny without French approval. It was sovereignty in name only, independence on paper but not in practice. Leaders could wave flags, sing anthems, declare national holidays, but when it came to money, the decisions were made in Paris. Africa owes you nothing, Traore declared, his voice cracking through the silence like thunder rolling across an open plain. It is you who owe us the truth. The truth that this system was built to extract, not to empower. The truth that debt is a weapon, not a helping hand. The truth that for every dollar we repay, we lose 10 in stolen wealth, forced privatization, and monetary control. His hand struck the podium, the sound echoing. We have paid. We have bled. We have surrendered generations to interest payments and austerity. And still you demand more. Still you impose conditions. Still you speak of reform, as if poverty is our failure rather than your design. Gasps rippled through the chamber, not polite murmurs, but audible shock-sharp intakes of breath, whispered exclamations in a dozen languages. Cameras flashed like lightning, illuminating faces frozen in surprise, anger, approval, fear. Delegates shifted in their seats, some leaning back as if physically pushed by the force of his words, others leaning forward, hanging on every syllable. Some African representatives began to applaud softly at first, hesitant, as if testing whether such a response was permitted in this hallowed space. Then, louder, more confident, rising to their feet. The applause spread like fire through dry grass. Even some smaller nations, island states burdened by their own debts. South American countries familiar with IMF conditions began to clap. It was not unanimous. Western diplomats sat stone-faced. jaws tight, eyes fixed on their tablets, as if pretending the moment could be ignored. IMF officials exchanged glances, whispers barely concealed behind folders and briefcases, faces flushed with either embarrassment or anger, perhaps both. Traore stood tall, his military jacket a sharp contrast to the sea of tailored suits around him, his posture unyielding, shoulders squared. He was not finished. "We do not ask for your permission to be free," he continued, his voice steady now. "No longer anger, but declaration. We have risen to claim it." The applause grew louder, rolling like a wave from the African delegations outward, crashing against the walls of the chamber and echoing through the halls beyond. It was undeniable. A shift had occurred. The script had been torn up, the old rules suspended, and for the first time in decades, the carefully constructed narrative of the IMF as benevolent lender, as partner in development, as necessary guardian of fiscal responsibility, was openly challenged on the world's largest stage. Within minutes, the speech went viral. Social media exploded across platforms. Hashtags trended across continents. Number Africa owes nothing, number Traore, number Sankara, number end debt colonialism. Clips of the speech were shared millions of times within the first hour, subtitled in dozens of languages, accompanied by commentary ranging from praise to fury. Young Africans in Nairobi, Lagos, Accra, Dakar watched on their phones and felt something stir, a pride long buried beneath narratives of dependency and failure, beneath decades of being told that poverty was their fault, their incompetence, their corruption. The name Thomas Sankara resurfaced globally, searches spiking as people connected the dots between past and present. Sankara, the revolutionary leader of Burkina Faso in the 1980s, had also stood before the world and declared Africa's debt illegitimate, had called for a united front to refuse payment. He had been assassinated in 1987, gunned down in a coup that many suspected had foreign backing. The question now whispered in every comment section, every forum, every newsroom, every cafe conversation from Johannesburg to Brussels: would Traore meet the same fate? But the speech had landed. The words were spoken, and words, once released into the world, cannot be recalled. They echo, they ripple, they ignite fires in places you cannot see, in hearts you will never meet. They become banners, slogans, anthems. They become memory. Yet here is the truth that hovers beneath the applause, beneath the viral clips, beneath the euphoria. Words are only wind unless backed by action. Declarations mean nothing if the morning after brings submission, if the pressure becomes too great, if hunger forces compromise. The world had heard Traore speak. Leaders had clapped. Citizens had cheered. But what came next would determine if this was revolution or suicide. Because history is full of speeches. History is full of brave words spoken in moments of passion. But history is also full of graves where those who spoke too loudly were buried too soon. The cameras turned off. The delegates filed out. The marble halls emptied. And the real work, the dangerous work, was only beginning. The world did not wait long to respond. Within hours of Traore's speech, the global chessboard began to shift, pieces moving in patterns both predictable and surprising. In Paris, senior officials convened an emergency meeting at the Élysée Palace. The ornate rooms, usually reserved for state dinners and diplomatic pleasantries, became war rooms. The tone was not diplomatic. It was panic barely concealed beneath layers of bureaucratic language. For centuries, France had maintained financial influence over 14 African nations through the CFA franc. It was an empire without soldiers, a dominion built not on occupation, but on currency, on the quiet control of central banks and monetary policy. And now, a young soldier president from a landlocked nation had named it publicly, stripping away the polite language of partnership and cooperation to reveal what lay beneath: control. One French diplomat, speaking anonymously to Le Monde, admitted with unusual candor, "If Burkina Faso breaks free, others will follow. And if the CFA system collapses, we lose more than money, we lose leverage over an entire region. We lose access. We lose influence. We lose the architecture of relationships built over generations. In Washington, the mood was quieter but no less uneasy. IMF headquarters on 19th Street became a hive of closed-door meetings, analysts poring over data, economists drafting response papers, communications teams preparing statements that said much while revealing nothing. Internal memos circulated through secure channels, assessing the damage to credibility. The fund had weathered criticism before, from economists questioning structural adjustment programs, from activists protesting at annual meetings, from debt relief campaigns like Jubilee 2000. But this was different. This was a head of state, speaking on the world's largest stage, with evidence sharp enough to cut through decades of carefully constructed narratives. Some analysts privately acknowledged the truth in Traore's accusations. One senior economist, quoted off the record in the Financial Times, said, "We have always justified conditionality as necessary medicine. Bitter, yes, but required for recovery. But when the patient dies from the treatment, when poverty deepens rather than alleviates, perhaps the diagnosis was wrong all along." London and Brussels watched with caution. The European Union had its own economic ties to Africa, its own aid programs, its own development frameworks built on similar logic. Loans with conditions, assistance with strings, partnership with hierarchy. If African nations began rejecting Western financial institutions en masse, the ripple effects would be felt across trade deals, resource agreements, and strategic alliances. Private warnings were circulated through diplomatic channels, delivered in meetings where nothing was written down, where agreements were sealed with handshakes and implicit threats. The message was clear, though never stated directly: comply or face consequences. Access to emergency funding might be reconsidered. Favorable trade terms could be withdrawn. Aid programs might shrink. Investment guarantees might evaporate. The language was never direct. It never is in these circles, but the message required no translation. Defiance has a price, and that price is measured in hunger, unemployment, and instability. Yet while the West hesitated, calibrating responses and managing optics, the East saw opportunity glittering like gold in sunlight. In Moscow, Russian diplomats floated offers almost immediately, moving with the speed of opportunists who recognize a crack in the edifice. They proposed hosting a summit on African debt alternatives, framing it as a forum for multipolar financial solutions, language deliberately vague but intent unmistakable. Moscow had little to lose and much to gain. Russia's economic influence in Africa was minimal compared to the West's, but geopolitical influence was another matter. If African nations pivoted away from the IMF and World Bank, they would need new partners, new sources of capital, new frameworks for development, and Russia, eager to expand its footprint on the continent, to challenge Western hegemony wherever possible, was ready to step in. Grain deals, military equipment, energy partnerships, all were on the table. Beijing moved with characteristic precision, less loud than Moscow, but more calculating. Chinese officials hinted at expanded credit lines through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and the China Development Bank, institutions that had already invested billions in African infrastructure over the past 2 decades. Unlike the IMF, these institutions did not impose austerity measures or demand privatization. They did not require governments to slash budgets for health and education. Instead, they offered infrastructure projects, roads, railways, ports, power plants, funded through loans tied to long-term resource agreements. It was a different model, less ideological, more transactional, patient in its timeline. And for African leaders, exhausted by decades of conditionality, by the endless cycle of loans and repayment and renegotiation, it was increasingly attractive. A senior Chinese diplomat, speaking at a forum in Addis Ababa, said carefully, his words chosen with diplomatic precision, "Africa's sovereignty must be respected. Financial partnerships should empower, not constrain. Development must serve the people, not distant creditors." The words were diplomatic, wrapped in the language of mutual benefit and win-win cooperation. But the implication was unmistakable. China was offering an alternative, and the terms were negotiable. Across the African continent, the reaction was electric, a current running through cities and villages, universities and marketplaces. In Accra, Ghana's capital, university students organized rallies that swelled from dozens to thousands within days. Banners read "Ghana owes nothing" and "Audit the debt, free the future." Young people marched through streets chanting slogans that mixed English, Twi, and defiance. The government, caught between popular pressure and creditor demands, issued cautious statements calling for transparent dialogue and sustainable solutions, words that satisfied no one. In Dakar, Senegal, murals of Traore appeared overnight on city walls, his face painted alongside Thomas Sankara and Patrice Lumumba, heroes of African independence, martyrs of foreign interference. Street artists worked in the dark, brushes moving quickly under the cover of night, images bold and defiant. By morning, the murals had become gathering points for young people who stood before them taking photographs, chanting, debating what comes next. In Mali's capital, Bamako, students at the university began memorizing lines from Traore's speech as if they were proverbs, reciting them in lecture halls and dormitories, writing them on classroom walls. "Africa owes you nothing" became a rallying cry, shouted at protests, printed on t-shirts sold in markets, woven into songs. Musicians composed anthems of resistance, blending traditional rhythms, the djembe and kora, with lyrics of liberation. In marketplaces and bars, people sang along, voices rising in unison, creating a soundtrack for a movement that had no formal structure but grew organically, fueled by decades of frustration finding sudden expression. Before we go further, let me pause and speak directly to you. If this channel has moved you, if these stories are touching something deep in your spirit, then consider becoming a member. Not for exclusive content or perks, but because supporting this channel is directly supporting narratives that mainstream media refuses to tell. Every membership is a vote for the Lion of Burkina's mission. Every member becomes a co-creator of the revolution we are documenting. Join us. Stand with the principle that African wealth belongs to Africa. Your contribution funds better research, deeper investigations, clearer truth. You are not just supporting us, you are supporting every leader, every nation, every voice, fighting for independence and dignity. The cultural shift was undeniable. Africa was no longer asking for permission, it was claiming a voice. Yet the risk grew equally fast, shadows lengthening as the sun climbed higher. International investors began whispering about raising borrowing costs for African nations deemed non-compliant, a euphemism for defiant. Credit rating agencies issued warnings, downgrading assessments, flagging risks. Aid organizations cautioned that food programs might shrink if governments rejected IMF guidance, framing it as concern for the vulnerable while implicitly threatening them. And across fragile economies already battered by drought, inflation, and instability, such punishments could translate into hunger and despair. The arithmetic was brutal. Less aid meant fewer meals in schools, fewer medicines in clinics, fewer seeds for farmers. Sovereignty, it seemed, came with a price tag denominated in suffering. Burkina Faso's own ministers debated urgently behind closed doors in Ouagadougou, voices raised in meetings that stretched late into the night. Some urged Traore to soften his tone, to walk back the rhetoric, fearing economic isolation that the nation already poor, already struggling, could not survive. "We applaud your courage," one minister reportedly said, "but courage does not feed children." Others pressed for bold partnerships with Russia, China, or the BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, a coalition positioning itself as an alternative to Western-dominated financial institutions. "Better to risk a new partnership," another minister argued, "than die slowly under old chains." Traore himself appeared unshaken. In a televised address to the nation 3 days after the UN speech, he spoke directly to the people of Burkina Faso. The camera was tight on his face, capturing the determination in his eyes, the set of his jaw. "This fight is larger than us," he said, his voice calm, measured, yet unyielding. "We do not ask permission to be free. We have risen to claim it. Yes, there will be hardship. Yes, there will be pressure from those who profit from our submission. But we have endured hardship for decades under the weight of debt we did not create, under systems designed to keep us dependent. If hardship is the price of independence, then we pay it with our heads held high and our eyes fixed on the horizon. Hope and fear now walked hand in hand through the streets of African cities. For ordinary people, the meaning was simple and profound. They were willing to endure sacrifice if it meant sovereignty, if it meant their children would inherit dignity rather than debt. A market woman in Ouagadougou, interviewed by a local journalist, captured the sentiment with clarity that no economist could match. "We have been poor for decades," she said, her voice steady despite the fatigue etched in lines around her eyes. "Our parents were poor. Their parents were poor. Poverty is nothing new to us. But if poverty is the price of freedom, if suffering today means our children walk as free people tomorrow, then we will pay it. At least they will inherit dignity, not just debt." But Traore was not finished. What he did next shocked even his closest allies, even those who had stood and applauded in the UN chamber. 2 weeks after the speech, he announced a series of domestic reforms that went beyond rhetoric, beyond symbolism, into the dangerous territory of action. First, he nationalized Burkina Faso's gold refineries, declaring that raw gold would no longer be exported without local processing. "Our gold will be refined here, sold here, taxed here," he announced in a press conference, his cabinet seated behind him. "Jobs will be created here. Wealth will remain here. We will no longer export our riches as raw materials only to buy them back as finished products at 10 times the price." It was a direct challenge to multinational mining corporations that had operated in Burkina Faso for decades under terms that favored extraction over development. Their profits had been enormous, measured in billions. Their contributions to local development had been minimal, measured in token schools and clinics that served more as public relations than genuine investment. Now, the terms were changing. Foreign companies would have to negotiate, to accept local processing requirements, or leave. Second, he formalized partnerships with non-Western nations, signing agreements and ceremonies broadcast live. With Russia, military equipment and training. With China, infrastructure projects including roads and a new refinery. With Turkey, agricultural technology and irrigation systems. These partnerships bypassed traditional Western channels entirely. They were not loans from the IMF or grants from USAID, not tied to governance reforms or austerity measures. They were bilateral agreements negotiated on terms Burkina Faso deemed acceptable, between sovereign equals, at least in theory. The message was clear. Africa could choose its partners, could diversify its dependencies, could play the great powers against each other if necessary. Third, he launched an education reform focused on economic sovereignty, announcing that schools would now include modules on debt structures, monetary policy, the history of colonialism, and its modern incarnations. "Our children will not grow up ignorant of how wealth is extracted," Traore said, passion breaking through his usual measured tone. "They will understand the system, and they will be equipped to dismantle it, to build something new, something just." It was an investment in the long game, planting seeds that might not bear fruit for a generation. But it was a commitment to ensuring that what Traore started would not die with him, would not be forgotten, would be carried forward by young people armed with knowledge. Now, let us turn this story into a shared moment. Write in the comments where you are watching from, your city, your country, your corner of the world. The Lion of Burkina will read them with gratitude. And we send to each of you a heartfelt wish. May your journey be filled with dignity, hope, and light. This is more than a video, it is a gathering of voices across the globe. Tell us where you stand, and know that we stand with you. Fourth, he mobilized youth programs aimed at agricultural self-sufficiency, directing resources toward farming cooperatives, irrigation projects to combat drought, and grain storage facilities to reduce dependence on food imports. Burkina Faso, despite its challenges, had fertile land and a young population eager for work, for purpose, for a future that felt like more than survival. Traore directed investment toward them. "Food security is sovereignty," he told a gathering of farmers in a rural village. Cameras capturing the moment. "If we can feed ourselves, we cannot be starved into submission. If our granaries are full, no threat of hunger can force us to bow." The lion's gamble was enormous, the stakes higher than most observers realized. Nationalization risked capital flight, foreign companies pulling out, taking expertise and investment with them. Partnerships with Russia and China risked alienating Western allies who still controlled access to international markets, to financial systems like SWIFT, to technologies and medicines. Education reform would take years, perhaps decades, to show results. Agricultural projects could fail if droughts persisted, if climate change accelerated, if pests destroyed crops. And through it all, the shadow of history loomed like a specter at the feast. Thomas Sankara had spoken similar words, had implemented similar reforms, nationalizing land, promoting self-sufficiency, challenging French hegemony, and had been assassinated within 4 years of taking power. His death was officially attributed to a coup led by his former comrade Blaise Compaoré, but many suspected foreign involvement, nations and corporations threatened by his vision of African self-reliance, by his refusal to play the game. Would Traoré meet the same fate? Security around him was tightened immediately after the UN speech. His movements restricted, his inner circle scrutinized for potential traitors. But as he himself had said in a private moment captured by a journalist, "You cannot guard against empires if they decide you are a threat. If they want you dead, they will find a way. All you can do is make your life count before they do." 3 months after the UN speech, an emergency session of the African Union was called. The agenda was deceptively simple but carried monumental weight: Africa's financial future. Delegates from 55 nations gathered in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in the same halls where the Organization of African Unity had once been founded, where dreams of Pan-African unity had been articulated and then deferred, again and again, beneath the weight of Cold War politics and neo-colonial interference. The session was closed to the press, but leaks emerged quickly. They always do when 55 delegations are involved. Traoré presented a proposal that was both visionary and terrifying in its ambition: a continental treasury and an African currency, a bold vision to replace reliance on the dollar, the euro, and the hated CFA franc with a unified monetary system controlled by Africans for Africans, governed by a central bank answerable to African nations rather than to Paris or Washington or Beijing. The reaction was mixed, exactly as expected. Some leaders, particularly younger ones from nations burdened by debt, whose populations were demanding change, were enthusiastic, seeing in the proposal a path toward genuine independence. Others, whose economies were deeply tied to Western institutions, whose personal fortunes were often entangled with foreign interests, were terrified. Ghana's president expressed concern about volatility, about the risks of launching a new currency in a continent plagued by inflation and instability. Kenya's Treasury Minister warned of logistical challenges, of the difficulty of coordinating monetary policy across economies as diverse as Nigeria's oil wealth and Malawi's subsistence agriculture. South Africa's delegation, representing the continent's most industrialized economy, called for caution, citing the fragile state of many African economies, the lack of infrastructure, the absence of trust between nations that had competing interests and historical grievances. Yet, even among the skeptics, something had shifted. No one openly defended the IMF. No one argued that the status quo was acceptable, that the current system was fair or functional. The debate was no longer whether the system was broken. Everyone agreed it was, but how to fix it, and how quickly, and at what cost. That alone was a victory. Perhaps Traoré's greatest one. He had changed the terms of the conversation. The question was no longer, can we afford to challenge the West? But can we afford not to? Meanwhile, sensing the momentum slipping, the IMF launched its countermove. A debt relief initiative was announced, with great fanfare. Press releases distributed globally, officials giving interviews on major networks, framing it as a generous gesture of solidarity with struggling nations. The offers sounded appealing on the surface: reduced interest rates, extended repayment timelines, even forgiveness of portions of debt for qualifying nations. But the fine print, buried in documents running to hundreds of pages, revealed the catch. Qualifying required compliance with new conditionality frameworks. Governments had to agree to governance reforms, which in practice meant privatization of state assets, deregulation of markets, and opening economies to foreign investment on terms favorable to foreign investors. It was the same medicine in a new bottle, the same prescription that had failed for decades, repackaged with softer language and better marketing.